Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Quebec Paranormal Incident. Imagine, if you will, the city of Montreal on the evening of November 7th, 1990. The air is crisp, carrying that specific bite of late autumn that settles into the bones. Below the towering skyline, the streets are alive with the low hum of traffic and the rhythmic click of heels on damp pavement. But as we move away from the noise, we ascend toward a sanctuary of concrete and glass. We find ourselves at the place Bonaventure, a massive, brutalist structure that feels more like a fortress than a building. On its roof, 17 stories above the city, lies a hidden world. It is a garden in the sky, a lush escape known as the Hotel Bonaventure. Here, the air smells of pine and damp earth, a strange contrast to the exhaust of the streets below. The night is heavy with low-hanging clouds, a thick gray blanket that masks the stars, turning the sky into a velvet void. The wind is a mere whisper, weaving through the trees of the rooftop garden, causing the leaves to shiver in the dark. At 7:20 in the evening, the world on the rooftop is quiet. The centerpiece of this garden is a heated outdoor pool, a shimmering turquoise rectangle that glows against the dark stone. Steam rises from the water in slow, ghostly curls, meeting the cold air and creating a soft, warm mist that clings to the surface. An American tourist is alone in the water, the only soul brave enough to face the November chill for a swim. She moves with a slow, rhythmic grace, her arms cutting through the heated water with a gentle splash. She is doing the backstroke, her face turned upward toward the heavy clouds. The water laps against her ears, a rhythmic, muffled sound that drowns out the world. For a moment, there is only the warmth of the pool and the cool dampness of the mist on her skin. But as she drifts toward the center of the pool, she blinks. Something is wrong with the sky. Through the veil of steam and the thickness of the clouds, a pattern of lights begins to emerge. It is not the distant flicker of an airplane or the steady glow of a planet. It is something massive, something silent, and it is positioned directly above her. The object is a colossal, metallic disc, hanging motionless in the thick air. It is so large that it seems to swallow the entire roof, spanning the length of 5 full football fields. Its surface is a dull, matte gray, like brushed steel that has been weathered by the elements. From its underbelly, light begins to spill out, not as a single glow, but as distinct, focused beams. There are 8 to 10 amber and yellow lights arranged in a perfect, geometric circle. Between them, beams of vibrant green slice through the mist, pointing outward like the spokes of a great, celestial wheel. In the very center, 2 brilliant white lights burn with an intensity that should be blinding, yet they feel soft, almost inviting. There is no sound. No roar of engines, no mechanical whine, not even the thrum of a vibration. The silence is absolute, heavy, and profound. The woman stops swimming, her body treading water as she stares upward, her breath hitching in her throat. The reflection of the lights ripples on the surface of the pool, turning the turquoise water into a kaleidoscope of gold and emerald. It is a moment of pure, crystalline stillness, where the laws of physics seem to have been suspended by this metallic giant. Trembling, the swimmer calls out to the female lifeguard stationed nearby. The lifeguard, wrapped in a heavy jacket against the cold, walks to the edge of the pool, her footsteps echoing on the wet tiles. She looks up, her hand flying to her mouth. The awe is immediate, a physical weight that anchors them both to the spot. They are joined by a hotel security guard who had been patrolling the garden. He looks at his radio, then at the sky, his training momentarily failing him in the face of the impossible. Soon, 30 people have gathered on the rooftop. Guests in thick robes, hotel management in suits, and kitchen staff in white aprons all stand together, their faces illuminated by the eerie, multicolored glow from above. They speak in hushed tones, their voices barely rising above a whisper, as if loud noises might startle the visitor. The air feels charged, static humming in the fine hairs of their arms. They watch as the object remains perfectly still, a silent sentinel watching over the heart of Montreal. It does not move, it does not pulse. It simply exists, a physical reality that defies explanation, casting long, shifting shadows across the rooftop garden. As the minutes turn into hours, the confusion spreads from the rooftop to the streets below. Police officer Francois Lipp is the first to arrive at the scene, summoned by the frantic calls of the hotel staff. He steps onto the roof, expecting to find a prank or a fallen weather balloon, but he finds himself staring into the face of the unknown. He reaches for his radio, his voice steady despite the adrenaline, and calls his superior, Commander Robert Masson. Masson, a man of logic and procedure, suspects an optical illusion. He orders the city to turn off the massive spotlights at the nearby construction sites, thinking perhaps the lights are reflecting off the low clouds. One by one, the great beams of the city go dark. The surrounding towers disappear into the shadows, leaving the sky even blacker than before. But the object does not fade. If anything, it shines brighter. The green and yellow beams become more distinct against the artificial darkness of the city. There is no doubt now. This is a solid craft, a physical presence estimated to be hanging between 8,000 and 10,000 feet in the air. As a cargo plane, visible on the local radar, passes at 6,000 feet, the witnesses watch as it flies beneath the object, a tiny bird passing under a mountain of steel. The radar at the airport remains blank. The sky is empty on the screens. Yet on the roof of the Bonaventure, the reflection continues to ripple in the pool, a silent witness to a night that would haunt the city for decades to come. The tires of the patrol car crunched over the wet pavement of Gauchetière Street, the sound dampened by the heavy, humid air of a Montreal November. Officer Francois Lipp pulled the vehicle to the curb, the engine idling with a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed out of place against the sudden, unnatural stillness of the evening. Through the windshield, the towering concrete mass of Place Bonaventure loomed like a fortress. It was 1990, and the city was caught in the transition between autumn and winter, a season of gray slush and low-hanging clouds. Lipp stepped out of the car, his heavy blue wool coat immediately absorbing the damp chill. He did not look up yet. Instead, he watched the people. He saw the hotel guests and the passers-by standing on the sidewalk, their necks tilted at sharp, uncomfortable angles, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of the street lamps and something else, something much higher. There was no shouting, no panic, only a heavy, expectant silence that felt like the air before a massive summer storm. His hand brushed the cold metal of his radio as he adjusted his belt, the leather creaking softly in the quiet air. He took a steady breath, smelling the faint scent of exhaust and the metallic tang of the coming snow, before finally allowing his gaze to climb the brutalist walls of the hotel toward the dark, swirling ceiling of the sky. Inside the hotel, the transition from the city's grit to the refined halls of the 17-story complex was jarring. The elevator ride was long and silent, a slow ascent that made the ears pop as the floor numbers ticked upward in a soft, mechanical rhythm. When the doors slid open at the rooftop level, Lipp was greeted not by the usual muffled sounds of the hotel's cube restaurant, but by the sharp, pungent smell of chlorine and the biting edge of the north wind. He stepped out onto the wide, open deck of the rooftop gardens. This was a place of luxury, a heated oasis where the water of the outdoor pool steamed in the freezing air, sending white plumes of vapor curling into the night like ghosts. Around the perimeter of the water, a small group of people stood motionless. There was the lifeguard, her face pale and drawn, and several guests wrapped in thick white terry cloth robes that flapped violently in the wind. They were not looking at the pool, nor at the sprawling garden of 2.5 acres that surrounded them. Their eyes were fixed on the void above. Lipp felt the cold settle into his bones as he walked toward the edge, his boots echoing on the damp concrete. He looked up, and for a moment, his mind struggled to categorize what his eyes were seeing. It was not a plane. It was not a helicopter. It was a presence. Hovering directly above the steaming pool, perhaps no more than 1,000 meters into the charcoal sky, was a massive, solid silhouette. It was circular, or perhaps a rounded rectangle, its edges blurred by the low-hanging snow clouds that drifted beneath it like translucent silk. From the base of this silent leviathan, 3 distinct, powerful lights burned through the mist. They were not the blinking navigation strobes of a terrestrial craft, nor were they the harsh, flickering white of searchlights. They were a deep, steady amber, a golden yellow hue that seemed to have a physical weight, casting a warm, eerie glow onto the surface of the pool and the faces of those watching below. From the center of the object, 6 white beams of light shot outward into the surrounding clouds, as if the craft were reaching into the dark with long, luminous fingers. The beams did not scan the horizon. They remained perfectly still, piercing the thick overcast layer at 1,100 meters. The object was so silent that Lip could hear the soft lap of the pool water against the tiles and the distant, muffled sirens of the city below. There was no hum of an engine, no rush of air from a propeller. It simply existed there, a metallic island suspended in the freezing atmosphere, defying every law of flight he had ever known. By 8:30 that evening, the rooftop was no longer a quiet retreat. Sergeant Robert Masson, Lip's superior, arrived on the scene, his boots clicking with a sense of authority that was quickly eroded by the sight above. Masson was a man of logic, a veteran of the force who looked for reflections and illusions before he looked for miracles. He stood beside Lip, squinting through the light rain that had begun to fall, his face etched with a deep, perplexed frown. Across the street from the hotel, a massive skyscraper was under construction, its skeletal frame surrounded by powerful floodlights and cranes. Masson pointed toward the site, wondering aloud if the strange apparition was merely a trick of the light, a reflection of those construction lamps against the peculiar density of the snow clouds. He picked up his radio, his voice crackling with a static that seemed more intense than usual. He ordered the construction crew to kill every light on the site. One by one, the massive spotlights across the street flickered and died, plunging the neighboring block into darkness. The witnesses held their collective breath, waiting for the golden lights above to vanish into the night. But they did not. The object remained, its amber glow appearing even brighter against the new shadows of the city. The white beams continued to spear the clouds, unaffected and indifferent to the man-made darkness below. The confusion began to radiate outward from the rooftop of Place Bonaventure like a ripple in a cold pond. The police officers, now joined by security and a growing number of hotel staff, retreated toward the communications room to seek answers from the world beyond the clouds. They reached out to the air traffic control towers at Dorval and Mirabel airports, seeking any record of a stray aircraft or a military exercise. The responses they received were identical and deeply unsettling. The radar screens at both airports were clear. To the sophisticated instruments of the aviation world, the sky above downtown Montreal was empty. There was nothing but the steady, invisible sweep of the radar beams passing through the very space where a massive metallic craft was currently visible to dozens of human eyes. Masson then contacted the St. Hubert military base, his voice steady but tinged with a growing urgency. The military confirmed the same. Their screens showed a void. The operator at Dorval admitted, however, that while their technology saw nothing, their telephone lines were melting down with calls from terrified citizens across the city. People from miles away were reporting the same 3 amber lights and the same silent, looming presence. It was a ghost in the machine, a physical reality that refused to be translated into the language of green pings and electronic data. As the clock ticked toward 9 o'clock, the officers returned to the rooftop to find the object exactly where they had left it. The rain was turning into a fine, crystalline sleet that stung the skin and coated the officers' blue uniforms in a thin, shimmering layer of ice. They stood in a row, the blue of their coats nearly black in the low light, their breath visible in the air. There was a profound sense of insignificance that began to settle over them. They were the law of the city, the keepers of order and the definers of truth, yet they stood powerless beneath a silent visitor that they could neither identify nor explain. The object did not move. It did not communicate. It simply watched, or perhaps allowed itself to be watched. The three lights seemed to pulse with a slow, almost biological rhythm, a deep golden heartbeat that synchronized with the falling snow. Every few minutes, a cloud would drift lower, partially obscuring the metallic hull, only for the light beams to push through the vapor once more, reminding everyone present that this was no cloud, no planet, and no dream. The officers, usually so quick to take command, simply waited in the cold, their eyes reflecting the amber glow of a mystery that had descended upon their city and refused to leave. The rooftop of the Hotel Bonaventure felt like an island suspended in a sea of gray mist. The heated water of the outdoor pool sent thin, ghostly ribbons of steam curling into the cold November air, mingling with the scent of chlorine and the damp metallic tang of the city. Below the 17-story concrete fortress, the streets of Montreal hummed with the low, rhythmic pulse of late-evening traffic. But up here, time seemed to have thickened. Dozens of people stood motionless along the edge of the water, their faces tilted upward, slick with the fine drizzle that had been falling since 7 o'clock. They were silent, a collective of strangers united by a shared, impossible sight. High above them, the sky held a guest that defied every law of the night. It was a massive, circular silhouette, punctuated by points of amber and emerald light that did not flicker or fade. The rain, which should have blurred its edges, seemed instead to slide around it, as if the object occupied a pocket of space where the weather could not reach. The witnesses watched, their breath hitching in their chests, as the craft remained perfectly stationary, a heavy and silent weight pressing down upon the atmosphere of the city. Officer Masson, his uniform dark and heavy with moisture, moved through the crowd with a professional calmness that masked his growing unease. He had already seen the object with his own eyes, but the rational part of his mind continued to search for an exit. Across the street, a construction project was underway, and powerful spotlights were casting long, reaching fingers of light toward the clouds. Masson reached for his radio, his fingers cold against the plastic casing. He issued a direct order to have those construction lights extinguished, hoping that once the beams were gone, the vision above would vanish with them, proving itself to be nothing more than a trick of reflection and shadow. One by one, the massive lamps across the street died out, plunging the immediate area into a deeper, more natural darkness. But the object did not disappear. It remained etched against the purple-black sky, its yellow lights glowing with an even greater intensity now that the competition from the ground had been removed. It was a physical reality, a metallic giant that seemed to be watching the city as intently as the city was watching it. While the crowd on the roof stood in awe, a very different kind of tension was unfolding a few miles away at the Montreal-Dorval Airport. Inside the air traffic control tower, the environment was sterile and dim, lit only by the soft, rhythmic glow of radar screens and the tiny, blinking indicators of communication consoles. The air was filled with the low hum of cooling fans and the occasional crackle of a pilot's voice in a headset. When the call from the police arrived, describing a massive craft hovering directly over the center of the city, the controllers leaned in, their eyes scanning the sweeping green lines of their monitors. The radar was a masterpiece of 1990 technology, a system designed to detect the smallest of private planes and the largest of international carriers. It sent out invisible pulses of energy that bounced off metal and bone, returning as a distinct blip on the glass. The controllers adjusted their gain, filtered out the static of the skyscrapers and focused their attention on the airspace precisely above the Hotel Bonaventure. They waited for the sweep to reveal the intruder, for the machine to confirm what the human eye was seeing. But as the luminous green arms circled the display, it passed over the coordinates of the hotel and found nothing but a hollow silence. The frustration in the tower was palpable. They reached out to the military radar outpost at St. Hubert, thinking perhaps a more specialized system might catch the phantom. But the answer was the same. The sky over downtown Montreal, according to the machines, was empty. There was no metal, no engine heat, no physical displacement that the sensors could recognize. Yet the reports from the ground continued to flood in. It was a ghost in the machine, a presence that existed for the soul but remained invisible to the silicon and the wire. The controllers checked their calibration, their hands moving over the dials with a frantic precision. They knew that something 540 meters wide, a size equivalent to 5 full football fields, should have been screaming its presence to the radar. An object of that magnitude should have created a return so bright it would have washed out the screen. Instead, the radar showed only the familiar, comforting echoes of the urban landscape. It was as if the object was not merely hiding, but was existing in a frequency of reality that the technology of man was never meant to perceive. Then a moment of startling clarity occurred. A cargo plane, a heavy and reliable workhorse of the night, appeared on the radar screens, making its steady approach toward the airport. On the rooftop of the hotel, the witnesses looked up and saw the plane's navigation lights, a small red and white blinking trail moving across the sky. They watched, breathless, as the aircraft passed directly between the roof of the hotel and the massive, glowing underside of the UFO. For the controllers, the cargo plane was a clear and solid blip at 1,800 meters of altitude. For the witnesses, the plane looked like a tiny toy as it glided beneath the colossal shadow of the visitor. This brief intersection provided a terrifying sense of scale. If the plane was at 1,800 meters, the object was likely hovering at 2,500 or even 3,000 meters above the ground. It was a physical barrier in the sky, large enough to eclipse the moon, yet it remained a secret to every technical eye in the province. The cargo pilot reported nothing unusual, unaware that he had just flown beneath the belly of a titan. The disparity between the two worlds, the technical silence of the airport and the visual witness of the crowd, created a deep sense of isolation for those on the rooftop. They were seeing something that the world's most advanced systems denied existed. The object sat there for 3 hours, a silent, unmoving guest that seemed to mock the limitations of human detection. It did not emit a sound, no roar of engines or hiss of air, only a heavy, vibrating stillness that some said they could feel in the marrow of their bones. As the minutes turned into hours, the rain began to intensify, and the clouds thickened, slowly wrapping the object in a shroud of gray wool. The lights grew dimmer, the amber fading into a dull glow, and the emerald beams retracting into the mist. It did not fly away with a burst of speed. It simply allowed the night to reclaim it, dissolving into the moisture and the dark until only the empty, raining sky remained. The witnesses were left standing in the cold, their clothes soaked through, wondering if the machines were right, or if they had just looked into the eyes of a truth that science was not yet ready to see. The air over Montreal had grown heavy with the peculiar, damp chill of early November in 1990. It was a cold that did not merely sit on the skin, but seemed to weave itself into the very fabric of one's clothing, seeking out the gaps in heavy coats and woolen scarves. Around the perimeter of the rooftop pool at Place Bonaventure, the gathered witnesses remained rooted to the concrete, their breath blooming in small, rhythmic ghosts that vanished as quickly as they appeared. For 3 hours, the world had been held in a state of suspended animation. The great, luminous craft above them had remained so motionless that it felt less like a vehicle and more like a permanent fixture of the heavens, a new and terrifying star that had descended to watch over the city. But then, as the clock pushed toward 10 in the evening, the stillness began to fracture. There was no sudden roar of engines, no violent disturbance of the air, and no mechanical whine. Instead, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the pressure against their eardrums, a feeling like the changing of the tide. The object, which had seemed carved from the very obsidian of the night, began to glide. It moved with a grace that felt offensive to the laws of physics. One moment it was centered, a crown of brilliant, multicolored lights reflecting in the chlorine-scented water of the pool, and the next, it had drifted several yards toward the north. The movement was smooth, devoid of the jagged inertia that characterizes human flight. It did not tilt or bank. It simply slid through the atmosphere like a needle through silk. The witnesses, some of whom were seasoned police officers and others hotel guests wrapped in thick towels, found themselves leaning in unison, their bodies tilting as if pulled by an invisible magnetic thread. The lights on the craft, those intense, white beams and the softer, amber pulses, seemed to soften as it gained momentum. They no longer cut through the dark with the same sharp aggression. Instead, they began to glow with a diffused, ethereal quality, as if the craft itself were beginning to soften at the edges, surrendering its solid form to the murky embrace of the Montreal sky. The sheer scale of it, estimated by some to be the size of 5 football fields, made its silent displacement of space feel almost dreamlike, a silent giant stepping over the city rooftops. Above the city, a low ceiling of clouds had been gathering throughout the evening, a thick layer of moisture and gray vapor that hung only a few thousand feet above the rooftops. As the object rose and drifted, it headed directly for this leaden veil. The onlookers watched, their necks aching from the hours of gazing upward, as the brilliant lights began to interact with the mist. The fog did not simply hide the object. It seemed to be illuminated from within, turning the gray clouds into a canvas of shifting, ghostly colors. It was as if a great lantern were being carried deep into a forest of smoke. The edges of the craft, which had previously been described as metallic and hard, began to blur and smudge against the darkness. The silence remained absolute, a heavy, suffocating quiet that made the sound of a distant car horn or the hum of the hotel's ventilation system feel like an intrusion. This was a private departure, a slow-motion exit that felt more like a fading memory than a physical event. The yellow and green beams, once so distinct, now bled into one another, creating a sickly, beautiful halo that pulsed within the churning gray vapor. The transition was agonizingly slow. The object did not zip away into the stars. It allowed the clouds to consume it, inch by agonizing inch. First, the peripheral lights flickered and then dimmed as they were buried under layers of water vapor. Then, the central core of the light, that brilliant, steady glow that had fascinated the crowd for 3 hours, began to wane. It became a duller, more muted silver, like the moon viewed through a thick sheet of frosted glass. The mist seemed to reach down and pull the craft upward, wrapping it in a shroud of gray and charcoal. To those standing below, it looked as though the very air were dissolving the metal, turning something solid into something spectral. There was a sense of profound mourning in the crowd, a collective feeling that something impossible was being reclaimed by the mundane world, leaving them behind in the cold and the dark. The police officers, who had spent the night trying to find a logical framework for what they were seeing, watched with a quiet helplessness as their evidence evaporated into the weather. The camera lenses of the journalists clicked and whirred, but they were capturing only the gray belly of the storm clouds now. By the time the final glimmer of light had vanished, leaving only the uniform, dark gray of the overcast sky, a strange lethargy fell over the witnesses. The object was gone, leaving no trail of smoke, no scent of fuel, and no lingering sound. The clouds closed up the hole where it had been, appearing once again as nothing more than the precursors to a November rain. The people on the roof stood in a circle of shared, stunned isolation, their eyes still burning from the intensity of the lights. They looked at one another, their faces pale and drawn in the harsh, artificial lighting of the pool deck, searching for a confirmation that what they had seen was real. The technical silence of the nearby airport remained unbroken, and the radar screens in the air traffic control towers continued to show a void where a massive craft had just been. The object had not just moved away. It had simply ceased to be a part of their reality, dissolving into the mist and leaving only the bitter cold of a Montreal night to fill the space it had occupied. The water in the pool, once a mirror for the lights of another world, now only reflected the sterile glow of the hotel's fluorescent lamps. The morning of November 8th, 1990, dawned with a heavy, leaden sky that seemed to press down upon the city of Montreal. The vibrant, unearthly glow that had hung over the place Bonaventure for over 3 hours was gone, replaced by the familiar, damp chill of a Quebec autumn. In the quiet corridors of the hotel, the air felt thick with a residual tension, a silence so profound it seemed to vibrate in the ears of those who had stood on the rooftop the night before. The lifeguard, Line St. Pierre, found herself staring at the empty patch of sky where the circle of lights had been, her fingers still tracing the rough edges of a notebook. It was in these early, gray hours that the first official footsteps began to echo through the lobby. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police did not arrive with sirens or fanfare. Instead, they appeared as a series of dark overcoats and polished shoes, moving with a deliberate, quiet authority that signaled the end of the spectacle and the beginning of the record. Investigator Luke Morin stepped into the hotel, his breath hitching slightly in the cold air, carrying a leather briefcase that would soon be filled with the fragmented memories of dozens of witnesses. Inside a small, wood-paneled office on the lower levels of the hotel, the air smelled of stale coffee and the faint, sweet scent of floor wax. Luke Morin sat across from the witnesses, his pen hovering over a stack of crisp, white paper. Each testimony was a thread in a growing tapestry of the impossible. He listened as the hotel's security officer, Albert Sterling, described the sheer scale of the object, a silent, metallic presence that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. Morin watched the way the witnesses' eyes darted to the corners of the room, as if still searching for the amber and green lights that had pierced the clouds. He recorded the details of the circular formation, the 8 distinct yellow orbs, and the white beams that had reached down like ghostly fingers. The scratching of his pen was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic, hypnotic pulse that turned the surreal events of the previous night into a series of numbered points and clinical observations. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that in this small, quiet room, the weight of the unknown was being transcribed into the language of the state. Across the city, in the cramped and chemical-scented darkroom of the La Presse newspaper, journalist Marcel Laroche stood in the dim, red glow of the safety lights. The world outside the darkroom was loud and chaotic, but here, everything was slow and deliberate. He moved his hands through the shallow plastic trays, the developer fluid swirling around the strips of 35mm film. Slowly, like a ghost emerging from a fog, the shapes began to appear. First, the dark silhouette of the hotel's edge, then the texture of the heavy cloud cover, and finally, the lights. They were grainy and haunting, captured in the silver halide of the film, a cluster of bright, defiant specks against the void. Laroche felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. These were not mere stories. They were physical evidence, a permanent chemical shadow of something that officially did not exist. He hung the negatives to dry, the thin plastic strips swaying gently in the stagnant air, each frame a silent witness to a 3-hour window where the sky had opened up. As the days bled into weeks, the investigation expanded beyond the local police and the federal authorities. The paper trail grew longer, winding its way into the hands of scientific researchers who sought to ground the fantastic in the world of data and measurement. Bernard Gannett, an investigator with a keen eye for detail, began to collaborate with Richard Haynes, a man whose background with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration lent a heavy gravity to the proceedings. Together, they began to assemble what would eventually become a massive, hundreds of pages-long report. They sat in rooms filled with the scent of old ink and the dry, dusty smell of archived files, poring over the sketches Line St. Pierre had made with such careful, trembling hands. They analyzed the weather patterns of that night, noting the exact altitude of the snow clouds, 1,100 meters, and the strange lack of radar confirmation from the nearby airports of Dorval and Mirabel. Every document they added to the pile was a testament to the contradiction of the event. A massive, 540-meter-wide object that was seen by hundreds, yet remained invisible to the electronic eyes of the military. The bureaucratic machinery of the investigation was a slow, grinding process that seemed to drain the color from the memories of those involved. The official reports were filed away in heavy, gray metal cabinets, tucked behind folders of more mundane concerns. There was a sense of a curtain being drawn, a quiet consensus that some truths were too disruptive for the public record. In the corridors of power, the files were marked with the heavy stamp of classification, the ink sinking deep into the fibers of the paper. Witnesses were told that their accounts were appreciated, yet the official statements remained cautious and noncommittal. The contrast was stark. The vibrant, terrifying reality of the lights over the place Bonaventure against the sterile, typed-out sentences of a government file. The paper trail did not lead to an easy answer. Instead, it led to a labyrinth of observations, photographic grain, and the enduring silence of the authorities. The researchers continued their work, their desks buried under a mountain of transcripts and analysis, but the heart of the mystery remained locked within the experiences of those who had looked up and seen the impossible. By the time the final reports were bound and filed, the event had been reduced to a series of coordinates and technical descriptions. The Haynes-Gannett report stood as a monument to the incident, its pages filled with complex calculations of light intensity and atmospheric refraction. Yet, even within its clinical pages, the awe of that night could still be felt between the lines. The document detailed how the construction site floodlights across the street had been turned off, proving that the phenomenon was no mere reflection. It spoke of the rhythmic, silent pulse of the object, a detail that haunted the researchers long after the files were closed. The paper trail, once a frantic collection of notes and photographs, had become a cold, historical record, a testament to a night when the sky over Montreal refused to be explained. The ink was dry now, the photographs tucked away in dark archives, and the witnesses left to carry the memory of the lights in the quiet corners of their minds, waiting for the day the papers might finally be allowed to speak. The investigation did not end with a grand revelation or a sudden, startling confession. Instead, it dissolved into the cold, damp air of a Montreal autumn. By the time the final official reports were bound in heavy cardstock and tucked into the steel drawers of the archives, the events of November 7th, 1990, had been stripped of their wonder and reduced to a series of technical coordinates and dry, clinical descriptions. Yet, for those who stood on the rooftop of the Place Bonaventure Hotel that night, the memory remained as sharp and biting as the wind whipping off the St. Lawrence River. Imagine the scene as the clock ticked toward 10:20 in the evening. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, metallic smell of impending snow. The massive, circular craft, which had occupied the sky for 3 long hours, did not zoom away with a flash of light. It did not disappear into a wormhole. It simply waited. It hung there, 540 meters of silent, impossible geometry, as the clouds began to thicken and roll in from the north. One by one, the amber and green lights were swallowed by the gray mist. The white beams, which had reached down like spectral fingers to touch the hotel's heated pool, grew dim and diffused, until they were nothing more than a faint, ghostly glow behind a curtain of vapor. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping city, but a heavy, pressurized stillness that seemed to ring in the ears of every witness present. When the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the local investigators finally retreated from the rooftops, they left behind a trail of unanswered questions that would linger for decades. The official inquiry, led by men like Robert Masson and later analyzed by scientists such as Richard Haynes, struggled to find a single thread of conventional logic to pull. They had looked at every possibility. They checked the flight paths of every known aircraft, but the radar screens at the airport had remained stubbornly blank, showing only the empty, dark sky where hundreds of eyes saw a titan of metal and light. They considered the powerful spotlights from the construction site across the street, but the police had ordered those lights extinguished, and the object had only seemed to grow clearer in the darkness. There were no balloons that could hover motionless in such high winds for 3 hours. There were no secret military prototypes that could remain perfectly silent while emitting such an immense amount of energy. In the years that followed, Richard Haynes, a former scientist with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, would sit in his quiet office, surrounded by the smell of old paper and the soft hum of a desk lamp, poring over the 25 pages of his final report. His conclusion was stated with a chilling, professional certainty. The evidence for the existence of a highly unusual, hovering, silent, large object was indisputable. He did not call it a visitor from another world, but he knew that the physical laws of our own could not account for its presence. For the American tourist who first spotted the lights while swimming in the rooftop pool, the world never truly returned to its original shape. She spoke of the way the water felt against her skin, warm and rhythmic, contrasted against the terrifying, frozen stillness of the sky. She remembered the colors, the deep, resonant amber and the sickly, alien green, and how they didn't just illuminate the clouds, but seemed to vibrate through the very air. The lifeguard, the hotel staff, and the seasoned journalists who arrived with their cameras all shared a common, haunting realization. They had seen something that was never meant to be measured. Even the photographs taken by Marcel Larache, though grainy and blurred by the low light of 1990, captured the unmistakable geometry of the lights. They were arranged in a perfect circle, 8 to 10 points of brilliance that defied the chaotic beauty of the natural world. As the investigation reached its conclusion, the authorities chose a path of quiet containment. There were no more press conferences. The files were not destroyed, but they were certainly not celebrated. They became part of the shadows in the cold, a legendary chapter of Canadian history that remains as solid and unyielding as the concrete walls of the place Bonaventure itself. The case was never solved because it could not be solved within the limits of our understanding. It remains a puncture in the fabric of the mundane, a reminder that the night sky holds secrets that do not care for our reports or our radar. As we look back at the Quebec Paranormal Incident, we are left with the image of a city paused in time. We see the faces of the witnesses, turned upward, their breaths blooming like small, white ghosts in the freezing air. We feel the texture of the mystery, the cold brass of the binoculars, the scratch of the pens on official statements, and the immense, heavy weight of the unknown looming overhead. The story of the shadows in the cold is not a story of answers, but a story of the feeling of being watched by something vast and indifferent. It is a story that ends in the same way the event did, with the clouds closing in and the world returning to its usual, quiet rhythms. Today, the hotel pool still ripples under the Montreal sky, and the city lights still flicker against the clouds, but there is a lingering sense that the sky is deeper than it looks. We have reached the end of our journey into these shadows. The technical reports are filed away. The witnesses have grown older. The lights have faded into the mist of memory, leaving behind only the quiet chill of a winter night. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.